Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Passive House podcast, recorded at North American Passive House Network's conference, Passive House for All, in June 2021 in New York City. In this, the 17th of 18 interviews we recorded amidst the hustle and bustle of the conference hall floor, I chat with Mikhail Haramati of New York State Energy Research and Development Authority and Bronwyn of NAPHN. A couple of quick thank yous before we get started. First, thank you to NAPHN for putting on the conference and for partnering with us on these interviews. Also, a big thank you to our sponsors who make everything we do at the Accelerator possible. Our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingui Architects, Glavel, Minotaur, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwool North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsor is SIGA, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA. With that, please enjoy my interview with Mikhail and Bronwyn. So we have Mikhail Haramati from NYSERDA and Bronwyn of NAPHN here to talk, and two powerhouses of policy thinking and development. And so, Mikhail, you were doing policy work in California for many years, and more recently, I think a year and a half ago, moved to New York and to do work in NYSERDA. And Bronwyn, you've been involved in policy work in California for quite a while, and I've admired that work, and I can't wait to hear insights about that. So maybe you could say a little bit about your work at NYSERDA, and maybe a little, refer to California, and we can see where this goes.
Sure. So I was hired to work on NYSERDA's Carbon Neutral Buildings Roadmap. And so what that is a framework for decarbonizing the buildings in the state of New York, the entire building stock by 2050. And we've been working on that for a little over 2 years, and we're actually debuting our draft roadmap next week in the form of 2 public webinars. So that's been really exciting to be able to really learn about the New York context and take a lot of my knowledge from California around the technologies and implementation strategies, and apply it to a different climate zone and really different issues around sort of building vintages and who is inhabiting those buildings. There's a lot more multifamily residents who are in affordable housing in the state of New York, and I think a much larger mix between high-rise buildings in the city versus low-rise single-family upstate.
Sure, yeah. And so you're into really small challenges, right?
Yeah.
That's super important. That's great. So we were just having a conversation about the kind of what is, and you just alluded to some of the ways that the work that you're doing in New York, or the context in New York, is different than the context in California. I'd love to hear more about those, how things are different, and also what the commonalities that you're finding, and maybe some key insights as well as to what role you see, both of you see Passive House playing in meeting our climate goals, meeting our, being part of the solution to the housing crisis and all that stuff. Again, a bunch of really small problems that we can discuss.
It's kind of an interesting conversation because, as we were mentioning, I've been really looking specifically at where Passive House fits in the policy landscape and how we can really best serve conventional, regulatory frameworks and accelerate our industry into this transformative, world that we know we can get to as Passive House advocates. We know what's possible, and using Passive House as, ironically, the accelerator for code implementation, like baseline code. And what I'm coming to see, and the sort of narrative I'm really now trying to get out into the market, is this parallel track pathway where passive house policies that are actually outside the conventional regulatory frameworks can serve as the high-speed rail to deliver and help support the local all stops train that is baseline code. And this parallel pathway is kind of where I've seen regions, the policies that in regions that are really accelerating passive house implementation are using this dual track pathway. And, I think for the longest time we've tried to integrate passive house into the conventional code framework and structure. And I just, came to the realization that they're not really, it's a sort of an apples and oranges mix. It's an oil and water. They're not really structurally compatible. And actually mixing them isn't the solution, but using them in parallel is really working well. And, this is coming back to the work that Mikhail's doing. Again, our passive house community can really start piloting all these new pathways for the rest of the industry to come behind and already have a community that's sort of like, tried different things and figured out like the easiest, most cost-effective, scalable pathways. And that's the passive house community in a perfect nutshell. Is we are the front runner. We're the curious, the bold and somewhat crazy sometimes, but we're the experimenters, right? And that's a very fabulous tool for our regulatory folks to really utilize. We can kind of really pilot a bunch of stuff. I'm seeing in California, I've been talking to the CEC and really now pitching passive house as we can develop the muscle for all the thermal bridge calculations that they know they need to sort of add into conventional code, but until there's enough of a community that actually has the confidence, has the capacity, and understands how to do it, they can't put that into conventional code, the code framework. It's just too much of a leap for them to ask, and they get too much pushback.
I was just going to say, I think that's exactly right, and I think that really the challenge that I see from the state and really sort of national global perspective is we need to find a way to future-proof our buildings and to make them be able to survive the variations in weather, precipitation, climate events that we know are coming. And if we're not successful at retrofitting the buildings that we have, then they're going to be abandoned, right? We know from an energy and resource use perspective that the best buildings in terms of lowest carbon emissions, lowest energy use, lowest materials, methane, right? All the different metrics. Those are the ones that we have already. So if we don't find a way to improve those buildings, then we're going to be out of luck. We're going to have to rebuild elsewhere. And so I think to Bronwyn's point about using the passive house principles, particularly around shell improvements, we have the ability to really revolutionize the way we build buildings going forward to make them much more appropriate for the types of climate scenarios that we know we're going to be facing and even are facing right now. And we also have the ability to train the workforce to accommodate that. And so I think that's where folks in the passive house industry really are saying, we know how to do it better. This is what's needed. And we've already gone out there and figured out how to overcome many of the challenges. We're sourcing the materials. We're figuring out what measurement tools work. We're doing the calculations so we know the trade-offs about best practices and what materials to use in various scenarios. We're importing the best technologies from Europe and from around the world. So this is what's needed really in order to jumpstart the US market. And like, we're not going to reach our climate goals if we don't do this. So I really see Passive House as being critical and at the forefront of enabling this type of really dramatic market change that's needed.
Yeah, it's great to hear, and it totally resonates. And I have a follow-up question about electrification and Saul Griffith, but before I do that, I'm curious to go back to this oil and water thing about Passive House and conventional code. So is that oil and water the prescriptive code versus performance code issue, or could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So what I found in my advocacy work in California is sort of trying to insert Passive House principles into the baseline code framework. We started by saying, okay, let's look at, the code framework moves forward in these the workshops where they review proposals to improve the code happen in these siloed is sort of a mean word for it, but it's sort of like these compartmentalized review sessions. So they look at envelope improvements in one session, they look at HVAC improvements in another session, hot water heating and lighting. So there are these compartments. So what I found was I was coming in going, okay, I want to improve air tightness, but if I don't simultaneously also improve ventilation, I could be actually advocating for a building science disaster. And so I found myself completely conflicted and unable to engage in this structure of how the code process moves forward, because it doesn't fit in a, they do review these things together, but I could potentially be saying, super airtight, but the ventilation proposal might not get implemented. So it's kind of this disjointed.
And the way the process works, it's like the atomized versus being holistic. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So, this is sort of where Passive House couldn't fit in the plug-in. It doesn't plug into the framework of how to move a policy forward. It has to be done.
Makes so much sense.
As this,
right. I mean, it's a paradigm shift. So that's like right. I mean, so that's the kind of the definition. It's not going to fit into the old approach. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was limited to saying stuff like, okay, what about just requiring a blower door test for our buildings, which in California is still not required, which like a lot of people are sort of shocked at. You are required if you do the performance path, and you have to have a HERS, review on site. But prescriptive is not, and so there's literally not a base of tradespeople who are familiar enough with having a blower door test done on site. So the feedback loop and the process of building awareness about how does that impact our buildings is a little bit challenged. And given the fact that we've had 3 years of dreadful firestorms, where smoke infiltration into our buildings now are really impacting all of our indoor air quality in a way that we've never had to deal with.
Yeah, we're experiencing that in Washington State
becoming, the ventilation and the air sealing. These are a combined measure. You can't really consider doing one without the other.
Yeah, thank you. It's very clear. So back to this building optimized, or making sure that we're optimizing the building envelope and seeing that as critical to the overall climate solution making that you're engaged with at NYSERDA. Lately there's been a lot of focus on electrification, which is obviously super important, especially as we're seeing the clean energy transition accelerate, and that's really hopeful news. And as that, there's all this attention paid to electrification, there can be a tendency to say, maybe energy efficiency isn't important. Maybe we can just focus on the gadgets that we're putting in buildings and not worry about the building envelope. And energy efficiency has lots of different benefits. So, climate mitigation is only one of them. There's all sorts of comfort and health benefits that brings along. So I guess what I would love to hear more about is, do you see at NYSERDA, are you all seeing in terms of the numbers that that deep energy efficiency or significant energy efficiency improvements in buildings and building envelope approach is critical to the climate mitigation, or is it that the other benefits are critical, so we'll take the climate mitigation benefits, or how integral is it?
It's both.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of what I refer to as like the passive house loading order of first doing passive measures, then looking to lower demand actively, and then looking to storage and renewables is really the right way to go. And so if you lower demand, then you don't have to accommodate as much capacity when you electrify on the grid, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's critically important. So New York is a winter peaking system.
Yep.
And adding additional load, right, without doing energy efficiency means that more capacity is needed.
Yeah.
But looking at the demand reduction that can come from efficiency and also grid integration and load management at buildings, I think is really still somewhat of an untapped resource in New York, particularly on the grid integration side. And in California, there's been a lot more work on auto demand response programs and ways of really taking the sort of like human reaction, like signal reaction part out of the equation, so that the demand reduction happens when it needs to and it's easy, right? And it's not actually like impacting people's lives in a way where you're really asking them to do without. And going back to Bronwyn's point about the sort of being able to optimize at the system level versus the whole level, I think that particularly in smaller states, there's an ability to really see the whole. And one of the things, just sort of comparing the two states that I found, is that California it sort of has like the large organization problem, right? Where it's a really large state and there are many different programs going on, many different actors. And so it's hard for any one person to kind of have a perspective on the entirety of the moving parts and how to optimize for them. And that's anywhere, right? And so that's where you end up with this compartmentalization. And so that's why I think it's especially important that smaller states and regions kind of take the bull by the horns and they say, okay, we can optimize at the system level because that's what we do anyway, right? So looking at all of our energy use, we know who our customers are, we know the socio-demographics, we can really see where the trade-offs are and where the benefits are going to be to residents. And I think going forward, we know that we need to make an impact on a reduction on the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. We know we need to reduce our methane use. And that's something that is important, I think, at a regional, national, international level. But at a very local level and an intimate level is the health impacts and the comfort benefits. And for the longest time in the industry, we've just said, we've called those non-energy benefits and we've sort of tossed them aside and we're like, well, they're hard to quantify and, they're sort of different things to different people. But particularly looking at folks in disadvantaged communities, places, particularly with renters where there's a lot of gas appliances that are maybe older and they're not combusting the natural gas fully, or there's a lot of indoor air quality issues surrounding use of those appliances, or even external, right, because they're located next to freeways or power plants or whatever. These are ways that we can make real impacts on people's lives that actually have measurable improvements around reduced asthma rates, improved health outcomes. And I think that we haven't done a great job, frankly, of really emphasizing the importance of those. So I think that being able to say, yes, we want to do this for regional, national, international reasons, but you yourself are going to have better health as a result is a really powerful message.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think the climate change and the fact, like the Texas freeze, the California firestorms, Hurricane Sandy, which is really the impetus that NYSERDA used to actually implement a huge amount of transitional updates to all of the codes and the resiliency are also going to be part of this new narrative that we're, promoting about buildings, and that resiliency. Your heat pump is not going to save you when the grid goes out. And I think all of these regions are really now coming up hard against this resiliency element in our buildings. And this is again like another, it's so funny. My friend Jay Gentry talks about Passive House as the universal donor. You can use it when you're talking about comfort. You can use it when you're talking about indoor air quality. You can use it when you're talking about health impacts. You can use it against resiliency, and you can use it from a utility perspective with this peak load reduction and this grid interoperability, which is the darling of the current. It's the darling du jour of the utility. Is like this grid interoperable buildings.
Yeah.
And I think I'd love to hear, Mikhail, your kind of perspective on that, because it's the direct response for industry is like, oh, we got to put all these BMS systems into our buildings because now they got to be grid interoperable. And it's funny because I think the Passive House response to that is, no, you just got to like shave off all of that massive peak demand to where your building just sips energy at this like amazingly low rate in a continuous flat line. And I've documented from performance monitoring of my projects, that's exactly what my buildings are doing. And this is a different tool that our utilities and policymakers can add to their tool belt that I think they haven't really accessed yet, or even thought was like, hey, that's something we haven't really discussed as an option for. It's just a different way of grid interoperability that we just need to now bring to the table. So
I love your description of that. It reminds me of sort of going from like maybe a little sort of like handheld cooler to a Yeti cooler, and we're realizing that basically like you can bring the Yeti cooler places that you couldn't bring a little handheld cooler, and it can really allow you to like ride out times of intense heat or intense cold. And that's what happens when the grid goes down.
Yeah.
And like particularly during heat waves, like people die, right?
Yeah.
And they die alone, silently in their homes. And we know this from the Great Chicago heat wave. It's not something that's super visible, and so it doesn't garner the same public response as a dramatic event like a fire or a hurricane. But when you just look at like straight mortality numbers, there are incredible public health impacts from this. And so really enabling people to be able to not only be safe but comfortable in their homes is just incredible. So if we can do that on a retrofit basis at scale, then we will have gone a huge way at being able to enable people to ride out these climate events.
Yeah, I need to make a plug. The Passive House Accelerator just released the Passive House Accelerator magazine. It's an issue all on retrofits. Mary James, the editor, has been kind of a student of retrofits for years and years and years, and so I'm really excited. I haven't read it yet, but I know it's going to be wonderful. So.
I'm
shameless
smiling broadly underneath this mask.
Well, we need the practitioners going in there, trying out the materials, measuring buildings, figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's important to note too that like we're in this situation where our buildings consume a huge amount of energy because of the invention of modern HVAC systems. So if you look at old
air
buildings,
conditioning.
They're pretty,
Just air conditioning, really.
But really historic buildings and even native people, right? Like the Pueblo Indians built these massive walled adobe structures. And there's an organization called Earthships in Taos, New Mexico, that are doing the same thing with, large, significant rammed earth walls. And it's not particularly complicated to create enough thermal mass to sustain a pretty temperate indoor environment. It's just that because of air conditioning and forced air systems, we've been able to keep the temperature constant in really like just building shells that are poorly or not insulated at all, right? So the question is like, how do we get back to kind of where we were before and get off of this reliance on these incredibly energy intensive systems?
We all have our goals are so well aligned. We all want the same outcome, and really seeing like where we can really do that, build that express train track to help the baseline code folks to move forward faster. That it has to collect the baseline code has to be the all stops train to collect everyone and bring the full entourage back. But the Passive House community can speed forward and do the heavy lift of like actually clearing the roadway. And I think this is where we really need to focus on exactly what we're good at and sell that in a better way to our policy folks, because we've been trying to do this combination business, which really, as I've seen, just hasn't been effective because it doesn't mix. So I think making that more visible and selling that superpower of like what we can bring as a community to help develop new innovative products, because all of those products can be used for those retrofits that we have to tackle retrofits. But what I see is the quality and the performance base of our existing materials isn't where it actually could be. And so we're doing retrofits using maybe not optimized products that lock our buildings into a subpar performance capacity. Whereas we could be installing much better products in those existing buildings that will keep them really resilient for a lot longer. So being able to speak to policymakers and connect our aligned goals and utilize what we can specifically bring to the narrative to allow them to like move things forward quicker, in the conventional regulatory framework. Being much more clear about like what we can bring to the policymaker table to support their efforts in moving, our aligned goals forward.
And that's what's most useful to us also. So it's, in these situations, I always want to sort of take on more of a listening role, because we know what the overarching goals are, but you and Bronwyn and others are the ones that are figuring out like how to actually get over these humps on the ground. And so if you say, hey, there's an issue here, we need to resolve it, that's that's extremely important to me, right? I hear that and I'm like, oh man, that's an issue. So let's figure out how to overcome these service upgrade issues or issues with electrical lines and getting cranes over them to do panelized retrofits, right? Because I know that at scale, that's going to prevent us from really ramping up the way we need to.
Yeah. But even in the field, actually what we find is we're discovering new opportunities that haven't been on the policy radar yet, because they just literally we've figured them out by doing and going, hey, we thought we should be doing this, but when we did it, we actually found this opportunity. And then having that feedback loop to be able to bring it back saying, that's a sort of grid interoperability, that conversation. It's like, actually, there's another option on the table that isn't being talked about and really should be, because it hasn't been on the policymaker radar, but we've really figured it out from our field, our boots on the ground work in the field. And I think that's a huge resource that has been underutilized to date, and I really want us to really optimize that and bring that out and like add that to the conversation. And I see NYSERDA is, I have to say, one of the leading utilities. And interestingly enough, I'm now having these similar conversations with the California Public Utility Commission, because the utilities are the ones who see, they're right at the front line of like having to supply this renewable grid and supply renewable energy to the existing buildings, and figuring out like, okay, how are we really realistically going to do this? So I think it's a perfect marriage of like figuring that it's utilities really are our most aligned, policy regulators, and focusing specifically on how we can work together with them. So it's kind of interesting to see how this is a natural evolution of like where we've, as a North American passive house community, have sort of evolved and figured out where our best use is and our most valued skill set is to our policymaker and our regulatory community.
Great insights from both of you, and thank you both for your leadership in your respective very important organizations in terms of this whole transition we're trying to accomplish. I really appreciate the chance to chat with both of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that special bonus episode of the Passive House podcast. On behalf of everyone here at the Passive House Accelerator, thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more on the Passive House podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.